Well, are we in for a treat today? Welcome to those of you who are in the room. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. There's as many people online as in the room, is my understanding. I just need to let you know that this is being recorded. And for those of you online, you've been sent a copy of the PowerPoint presentation in advance. Before we begin, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that we're meeting today, the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I don't know about you, but I just drove here along the banks of the Swan River, the Derbarl Yerrigan, and really appreciated the beautiful land that we're meeting on today. I'm Bronwyn Clark. I'm the chair of the West Australian Livestock Research Council, and this event is being presented to you today by WALRC and by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. Joining me to host this event is Mandy Curnow and Corrine Bleckensop from DPIRD. So for those of you who don't know, the primary purpose of WALRC is to identify research and adoption priorities through producer consultation and to feed those priorities back to our funding bodies like Meat and Livestock Australia to help inform R&D programs. So together with our producer members, our industry members and our co-investors, what we aim to do is we aim to facilitate collaboration to get the absolute best outcomes for R&D in the WA livestock industries. So it is absolutely fabulous to see so many people in the room representing the different sectors of our industry today. And also online, we've got the same sort of group of different parts of the industry here as well. So I'd like to thank UWA for allowing us to meet here today. UWA are one of WALRC's co-investors. Understanding the carbon footprint of our business continues to be a very high priority for our WALRC producers. And it's our partnership with DPIRD in this space that's got us here today. The Climate Resilience Task Force within DPIRD has been set up to support the low carbon transformation of WA's primary industries, in line with the government's WA climate policy. And this task force is aimed with leveraging the Climate Resilience Fund and other funds to build capacity and understanding of climate resilience agriculture. So on behalf of WALRC and DPIRD, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Frank Mitloehner. Now, Frank has a Master of Science degree from Leipzig University in Germany and a PhD from Texas Tech University. He was actually recruited then by the University of California in Davis in 2002, and he was their first ever position that focused on looking at the relationship between livestock and air quality, which is what we're here to talk about today. Now, Frank leads the CLEAR Centre, which is based at the Department of Animal Science at the University of California. Now, CLEAR stands for, and I'll have to get this right, Clarity and Leadership for Environmental Awareness and Research. And I think that's a pretty good start when we're looking at such a complex issue. Okay, so I hope we're going to get a really good description from Frank today about the work he's doing. This centre combines research and extension to help the livestock industries operate more efficiently and meet the demands of a growing population while lessening the impact on environment and climate. Now, some of you would have seen or participated in discussions with the GHG guru on Twitter. I've spoken to a few of you today who feel like you know Frank because you've had discussions with him online already. He's really committed to making a difference to generations to come and helping our global community understand the environmental and human health impacts of livestock so that people are actually making informed decisions about the food that they're eating and while reducing environmental impacts. Now, I know that in the room today, we represent many parts of the livestock industries. Don't worry. I note that Frank has published many scientific papers in dairy and beef cattle, pig and poultry production, as well as human health and air quality. Don't worry, I even found a paper referring to Californian sheep production. So the sheep are in there too. So please join me in welcoming Frank to the stage, telling us more about air emissions from livestock and about the new methane accounting for agriculture. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm so honored. I'm so pleased to be here. And this is the first time in 25 years that I've been to Australia. I have been here 3 times, and every time was about a 3-month or so period. I worked on stations, tropical fruit farms, on both beef and sheep stations, and I was a student at the time. And the people like you were so generous, inviting me to work with them, learn with them. They taught me how to ride a horse and not fall off too often, and so on. So it is a great pleasure for me to be back here and to talk to you today about livestock and climate, and particularly about methane. And the reason why I want to talk about methane is because I view methane as the Achilles heel of animal agriculture. It is methane that's the main livestock-related issue when it comes to climate. And so it is very, very imperative that we understand the nuances around methane very well. Okay, so that's why I'm here today. Methane accounting for agriculture. You can imagine that's not a typical California bull. This is a Texan Longhorn here. But I love that image. I love that image. So, was already mentioned in my introduction that I'm the director of the CLEAR Center. The CLEAR Center is a sustainability center that does both research and extension/communication around sustainability. So I have 6 PhD students and postdocs, as well as other professional scientists on the one side, on the research core. But on the communications and extension core, I also have several people, one of whom is here today, Kevin, who helped me with the communications part. Because if there's one thing where people in animal agriculture have really not been strong, and that's really all over the world, not just in the United States, it is communicating with the public, communicating on how they produce food and what kind of practices are deployed and so on. That is where we have been traditionally weak. So I have actually hired journalists and social media experts and videographers/filmmakers, those kind of people to help tell the story of animal agriculture. And this is not some kind of greenwashing or creative accounting I'm talking about. I'm talking about fact-based informations that we break down in ways people can understand, regardless of who that audience might be. And that is something that agriculture has not really done well in the past. So research projects we do are things such as the one I talk about today, Rethinking Methane. We talk about ways to either reduce emissions from animals directly or from their manure. We do research around feed additives. A lot of this has been done here in Australia on asparagopsis and other additives. I'm specialized in air quality and climate greenhouse gases and quantifying them on the one hand, quantifying them and mitigating them. We also deal with other pollutants, some of them related to nitrogen. That might be a topic that is not very common here yet, but it is a huge topic in Europe. You want to know what the next big issue is after dealing with the climate impacts of animal agriculture? It will be nitrogen. And if you want to know more, just check in what's going on in the Netherlands right now, where the Dutch government is trying to buy out 1/3 of all animal agriculturalists. They want to buy their farms. And when farmers decide to sell their farm to the government, they have to sign on the dotted line that they will never be a farmer again, and neither will their kids. The Dutch government has put out 25 billion, that's a B, 25 billion euros to buy out 1/3 of the animal agriculturalists. And it's all about nitrogen. And so if I want to know in California what the next big topic will be, I know that I need to look at what is going on or what was going on a few years back in Northern Europe, because that's where all these large sustainability topics start. And the big topic in Europe right now is reactive nitrogen. So while I talk about greenhouse gases today, and here in particular methane, I never lose my focus of all the other issues that also might pop up. So we also deal with issues such as that. There are some people who say all we need to do is replace eating meat and other animal source foods with plant-based alternatives, and then we have done the right thing for the climate. Well, I respectfully disagree, but obviously you have to do research in order to show, and we do a lot of studies on this as well. And then, as I said, we also do extension, and here we have a communications core in the CLIA Center that works on producing explainers. These are relatively easy pieces that explain certain topics. For example, what is carbon sequestration? Or how do cows affect the climate? And so on. These explainers are very successful. If you Google these things, you want to know what carbon sequestration is, very likely do you see CLIA Center explainers popping up first. We write blogs, more detailed pieces of information. We do news stories, we do YouTube videos, and so on, and tell the story of agriculture. Now, the topic today is really largely around methane. And when people hear methane, especially in the farming community, they think of a problem, right? You think of a problem. But is methane always a problem? If you think what just happened in Europe with this Ukraine war, and as a result, the Russians no longer supplying energy to the rest of Europe, what they cut off was gas delivery to the rest of Europe. That gas that went through the pipelines was methane gas. That's methane gas. Natural gas is methane gas. So would you say that that gas is bad? No, it's not. It is only bad if you treat it wrong, if you don't manage it. If you let it escape into the air, then it's a problem. If you manage it and you make power from it or fuels from it or so, then it can be an asset. It depends on what you do with methane. And you will see that throughout my talk. Methane can be a problem if we don't manage it. But methane can also be the opposite if we do manage it. And I hope I will convince you today. What you see here is a typical California dairy. Our dairy sector in California is the largest in the United States. We have about 2 million lactating cows, well, not quite, 1.8 or so million lactating cows. We're the largest dairy sector in the country, producing about 20% of all US milk products. And the average size of a dairy is 1,500 lactating cows. So here you see a typical one. And what you see here, and I'll talk about this a little later, is that what used to be an open lagoon where the manure generated gases that went into the atmosphere, in many cases, that lagoon is now capped. And the gases that previously escaped are now trapped and converted into useful products. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, then most often people use a so-called matrix, a way of comparing the different greenhouse gases to one another. And that matrix that has been used since 1990 is called GWP 100, Global Warming Potential 100. Please pay attention on that slide or to this slide, because I will talk about this throughout my talk. When comparing methane and nitrous oxide, those lower two greenhouse gases, to CO2, then this matrix is used that simply says that methane is 28 times more potent, so to say, than CO2 in trapping heat from the sun. One molecule of methane is as potent as 28 molecules of CO2. And one molecule of nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than CO2. That means that, just to give you an analogy, if we were to go drink, and we all drink from the same volume glass, one drinks beer, one drinks wine, one drinks vodka, we all know who will have a buzz first, right? Different potency of these drinks. But a better analogy is actually one where we want to put coffee into beverage containers and keep it warm. So imagine having a beverage container that's a styrofoam cup versus a China cup versus a Starbucks $20 insulated cup. We put coffee into those three beverage containers, and we all know it stays warm different length of time. Same is true for these greenhouse gases. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It has more punch to it in trapping heat from the sun than CO2. And nitrous oxide even more so. So if, let's say, you were to have a feedlot or dairy or something, and your operation were to produce 10 tons of methane per year, and you want to know how does that equate to CO2, then all you need to do is multiply the 10 tons your operation produces times this factor 28, and out comes 280 tons of CO2e. Okay? CO2 equivalent emissions, it's called. That is how the world calculates, quantifies methane and compares it to CO2, just using this GWP 100. The same is true for nitrous oxide. If, let's say, your operation were to produce 10 tons of nitrous oxide, all you need to do is multiply 10 times 265, and out comes 2,650 tons of CO2e. Okay, so this is how the world has been quantifying methane and nitrous oxide, and how the world has been comparing these gases to CO2. I've been critical of that for a long time, not because I don't think methane is a problem. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, but I've been criticizing it because there's more nuance to how methane is different from other greenhouse gases. And that is depicted on this slide. What you see on this slide here is the global methane budget. The global methane budget. You see on the left side various sources of methane, including fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. All of these combined produce a total of almost 560 teragrams of methane, 560. And this is where a lot of the reporting and the media attention ends, not mentioning that methane is not just produced by sources, but for methane, there are also sinks, meaning there are processes that destroy methane. And these sinks amount to a total of almost 550 teragrams. So you see these two half bubbles, sources 560, sinks 550. The difference is what we really have to worry about. And this is still a number that we seek to further reduce. I want to be on the record as saying methane matters and we want to reduce it. But it's important to account for the fact that methane is not just produced, but also destroyed. And that makes methane different from the other greenhouse gases, which are not destroyed in the atmosphere. CO2 and nitrous oxide are not destroyed in the atmosphere, but methane is. So now the logical question is, what destroys methane? If you look on this side of the slide, it shows a huge arrow pointing down. You see the number is very high. And underneath it says, sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. What does that mean? Imagine this fist being a methane molecule in the air. Within about a decade, 10 to 12 years, this methane molecule meets its maker, a so-called radical. It's called a hydroxyl radical. That's what it's called. And this hydroxyl radical destroys methane. And that happens within approximately 1 decade. The same does not happen for CO2, it does not happen for nitrous oxide, but it does happen for methane. And that destruction of methane is a very important nuance in the whole discussion as to how that gas warms our planet. And that's what I'm about to show you. So remember, methane is a different kind of gas. It's not a long-lived climate pollutant like CO2, which lives for 1,000 years, which is active for over 1,000 years, or nitrous oxide, which is active for over 100 years. It's not a long-lived climate pollutant, but it's a so-called short-lived climate pollutant. And that really matters. So remember, methane has a budget. It's not just produced, it's also destroyed. And that destruction is called atmospheric removal of this gas. Atmospheric removal. And why that matters will become very clear in a few minutes. The fact that methane is not just produced but also destroyed leads to this difference, namely the half-life difference of this gas, which is not like CO2 1,000 years or like nitrous oxide 110 years, but methane has a half-time of 12 years. Okay, so now you will probably ask me, well, why does that matter? So I call methane the fast and furious greenhouse gas. Furious because it has a good punch to it. It's potent. But fast because it has a short lifespan. I'll now talk about something that is important and also oftentimes misunderstood. So I try to really get that nuance right, okay? So methane chemically is CH4. So you can see methane has carbon to it. So first of all, why do we care about greenhouse gases in general? Why do we care about them? Why do we care about greenhouse gases? Because they lead to warming of our planet. That's why we care about greenhouse gas, because you can trap the heat from the sun. The Paris Climate Accord that the world has signed on to has as a goal not to reduce CO2 equivalent emissions a certain magnitude, but the goal is a warming goal, namely to keep us from adding additional warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade. That is the goal of the Paris Climate Accord, to limit additional warming. The way we quantify methane right now is simply by saying methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. Everything is converted into CO2 equivalent emissions. That's it. That's what you get when you use this GWP 100 that I alluded to a few slides ago. But GWP 100 that develops these CO2 equivalent emissions does not really tell you what the impact of an industry is on warming. So let's say you were with the beef industry or the dairy industry in the state. If you use this GWP 100 to calculate your impact, all you get is CO2 equivalent emissions. What you don't get is the actual warming impact of your industry. But that's what it's all about. That is the reason why we care about greenhouse gases, to limit additional warming. This GWP 100 will never give you that answer. And that's why people like myself have been criticizing it. Because this unit, this matrix, in my opinion, is not fit for purpose to describe the impact of an industry on warming. So now, I just told you methane is not just produced, methane is also destroyed. So where does the carbon in that methane, where does that carbon originally come from? The methane that animals belch out or that comes from their manure, where does it come from? It starts out with atmospheric CO2. Atmospheric CO2 during photosynthesis of our feed plants is taken on by those feed plants during photosynthesis, where plants need sunlight, water, and a source of carbon. That source of carbon, ladies and gentlemen, is atmospheric CO2. That's where the carbon comes from the air. It goes into those feed plants and then becomes either cellulose or starch. The plants produce cellulose or starch, and our animals, in this case a ruminant, eat that carbohydrate, in this case it's cellulose, and in their rumen, microbes produce methane gas. The majority of methane from ruminants is escapes through the mouth, called eructation as a product of enteric fermentation. It's belched out. More methane also comes from the animal manure. These are the two principal sources of methane gas. But is that carbon in this methane that the animals produce, is this carbon here in this methane new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere? Or was it in the atmosphere before? And the answer to that question is, it was in the atmosphere before, but in a different form, in the form of CO2. The carbon in this methane, in the so-called biogenic methane, the methane from biological sources, that carbon is not new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere, but it has changed forms. It stays in the atmosphere for approximately a decade, is converted through a process called hydroxyl oxidation. These are the radicals I talked about before, back into CO2 where it came from. So the biogenic carbon cycle is one where carbon changes its form from atmospheric CO2 to cellulose or other starch or so, then into methane. That methane is belched out or it comes from the animal manure, and then it meets these radicals in the atmosphere and is destroyed and converted back to where it came from, CO2. And this cycle goes around and around and around. What's really important is this. If you have a constant livestock herd, Let's say in a certain state, you have 1 million cattle. I'm just making this up. You had 1 million cattle in 1980, 1 million cattle in 2000, 1 million cattle in 2020, and you're predicted to have 1 million cattle in 2040. Then this constant source of methane from the constant cattle will not cause additional warming. Will not cause additional warming. Why not? Because almost an equal amount of what's produced is also destroyed. So if you look at changes of methane over time, then the constant source of methane does not cause additional warming. If you change the methane source, and let's say you go from 1 million to 1.2 million to 1.4 million, 1.6 million, then this increased methane over time will cause a lot of additional warming. However, if you reduce methane over time, then you're actually replenishing less methane than you add back into the atmosphere. A reduction of methane can reduce warming. So we don't want to increase this gas over time. We want to either hold it constant, and that's what we've done in most developed countries in the world. In some developing countries, methane has gone up because livestock herds have been growing due to increasing demand of animal source foods. And in some regions of the world where mitigation is aggressive, methane is now going down over time. And what that does to warming, I will show you, because there's really hope in this whole methane story. But remember, the biogenic carbon cycle, that's the one that describes these biological sources of methane, is circular. Okay? Is this similar or different from fossil fuels? Fossil fuels being oil, coal, and gas, and the related greenhouse gases there. The answer is it's quite different. Why and how? So oil, coal, and gas are nothing other than plants and animals, such as dinosaurs, that lived, decayed, fossilized hundreds of millions of years ago. That fossil fuel then accumulated underground, that's the black here, accumulated underground until 70 years ago, 70, humans started to extract that stuff, oil, coal, and gas. We have taken about half of those fossil fuels out of the ground, and what did we do with it? We burned it. So where's that carbon that was down there for so long? Where's that carbon now? I see thumbs going up. Correct. That carbon, we are talking about massive amounts, that was in the ground for hundreds of millions of years, is now in the atmosphere, and every time the sun hits those carbon molecules, they heat up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is unquestionably the #1 contribution of human activity to climate change, the use of fossil fuels. This is not a short-lived cycle. This is a one-way street from the ground where that carbon was for so long into the atmosphere where it's now. So biogenic carbon versus fossil carbon are really quite different. This slide here shows the direct comparison. On the left side, you see ancient carbon that was in the ground for so long being pumped up or dug out the ground and then burned with cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships. That's the one-way street of carbon from the ground into the atmosphere. On the right side, in this convoluted mess here, you see atmospheric CO2 that was in the atmosphere taken on by plants. Some of that carbon stays above ground, but the majority goes below ground into the roots. And from there, soil microbes take that carbon on, a process referred to as soil carbon sequestration. About 1/3 of all human-caused carbon that was in the atmosphere is stored in healthy soils and captured there. So if you, let's say, run a station and you're not plowing that, you're not tilling that area, then the carbon that is sucked out of the air by your plants during photosynthesis is making its way into the ground where a lot of that is sequestered. By the way, in most places throughout the world, farmers get zero credit for that. So now we have carbon in the ground. It's locked in the ground, soil carbon sequestration. Our cow in this case here, they eat some of that above ground vegetation, produce methane. That methane is either belched out or coming from its manure but after a decade or so, it is going back to where it came from, atmospheric CO2. So on the left side, you have a one-way street of carbon. On the right side, you have a relatively short-lived cycle. Does that mean that the methane that comes out of our animals, this methane here, that this methane doesn't matter? No, it does not mean that. While that methane is in the atmosphere, it has radiant forcing. So it does warm up the planet. But a constant source of methane from biogenic sources does not cause additional warming. It generates constant warming. And with it, it would actually comply with the Paris Climate Accord. Because if you have constant warming, you don't add additional warming, then you are what the Paris Climate Accord is asking for, not causing additional warming. And that's really the take-home message to agriculturalists throughout the world. Don't add additional warming. The goal should be, in my opinion, climate neutrality or net zero warming, not to cause additional warming to our planet. So is this clear here so far? This is kind of important. So I am in no way saying biogenic methane doesn't matter, fossil methane does matter. While these two methane types are in the atmosphere, they both trap heat, they both contribute to warming. But in the left case, it's always additional carbon added to the atmosphere. On the right side, it's not additional, it is carbon that's going around and around and around. Okay? So now I have a couple of slides that I think are really important. Some of them will get a little technical, but they are really important to understand why methane is different, a different beast, and why it's important for us to understand that. So imagine you were to live 20 kilometers away from work. And every day you drive to work, you burn gas, you burn, what do you call it, petrol, or I'm sorry, I've forgotten. But in the US, we call it gas. So on day one, you drive your car and you put CO2 into the atmosphere. On day two, on Tuesday, you drive again and you put the same amount into the atmosphere, which is now in addition to the existing stock from the previous day. On Wednesday, you drive again, on Thursday, on Friday. Every time you drive your car, you add additional carbon to the atmosphere, additional to the existing stock from the day before, the week before, the month before, the decade before, and so forth. This gas stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. The fact that you're adding additional gas to the existing stock makes this gas, CO2, called a stock gas. It accumulates in the atmosphere. It never goes down. It goes up, 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 and up because it has a 1,000-year lifespan. Everybody clear? Now, currently, methane is treated, when we use GWP 100, as if it were a stock gas too, as if every time, every day your cows belch, that methane were additional to what she belched last year and 10 years ago. But is it additional? No, it's not additional. Methane is not a stock gas. Methane is what we call a flow gas. If you were to have a constant herd size over several decades, then you're not causing additional warming, but constant warming. I will now give you an analogy because I think they are very powerful. An analogy how CO2 warms the planet versus how methane warms the planet. And I use two bathtubs for that analogy. The first bathtub analogy is the one for CO2. That is a bathtub that has a faucet, but it has no drain. Every time we turn on the faucet on low, medium, or high, we add water to the bathtub, and as a result, the water levels rise. They can never go down. There's no drain in that bathtub. Okay? Now comes the second analogy, the one for methane. The methane bathtub analogy has a faucet, but it also has a drain, and the drain is always open. The drain stands for the atmospheric removal of this gas. The drain is always open. So if I turn that faucet on normal, then I add water to the bathtub, but an equal amount goes out through the drain. As a result, the water levels stay stable. If I turn the faucet on low, then I add less water to the bathtub than I let go of through the drain. And as a result, the water levels can go down. And only if I crank that faucet up all the way, I add more water to the bathtub, then the drain can let go of. And then the levels will rise even though there is a drain. This is what happens, ladies and gentlemen, to methane. If we have a constant source of methane, then we have stable warming. A constant source of methane is pretty stable with respect to warming. If we increase methane over time, then we increase warming, and we do not want to do that. In parts of the developing world, we are doing that. In most developed countries, by the way, we're not doing it. In most developed countries, livestock herds are either constant or they're shrinking over time because efficiencies are improving. And if we reduce methane, let's say through mitigation, here in Australia, you do a lot of work around aspergillus and so on. If we use mitigation, we reduce methane, then warming can go down. Reducing methane means we are reducing warming. The same does not happen for CO2 or nitrous oxide, but it does for methane. And that is what makes this gas a different beast. So colleagues of mine from Oxford University, under Miles Allen, who is a former chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, years ago said, the way we are quantifying methane using GWP 100 is wrong. And when the chair of the IPCC says that, people pay attention. He said years ago, and we completely concurred, that if you use this GWP 100, let's say for a constant source of methane, let's say a constant cattle herd, then you're overblowing the impact of that constant source of methane on warming by a factor of 3 to 4. Years ago, people shook their heads saying, oh gosh, this cannot be true. And why are they saying that? When I said it, people said, well, he's too close to agriculture, maybe he has a bias. Well, this is the point I just made. GWP 100 overstates methane's warming impact by a constant source, let's say constant cattle herd, by a factor of 3 to 4. The same colleagues at Oxford University said, the old matrix is wrong. We need to use a new one that predicts the impact of this gas on warming. And they developed a new matrix called GWP star. GWP star, and you will hear me talk about this in a few minutes, actually characterizes the impact of this gas on actual warming. It does take into consideration that this gas is not just produced, but also destroyed. And that's not a tiny part of the narrative. This is really important. And so this GWP star accounts for the short lifespan of these gas, of this particular gas. And how this GWP star differs from GWP 100 will be seen in a second. But before I say that, I want to point out that this is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC report from 2021 called AR6. And in this report, that's the most recent one on the global level, on this IPCC, or in this IPCC report on page 123, and I will quote this, it says, expressing methane emissions as CO2 equivalent emissions using GWP 100 overstates the effect of constant methane emissions on global surface temperatures by a factor of 3 to 4. What I just told you, we've been saying for years, is now reflected by the IPCC. They're saying GWP 100, the matrix that has been used for the last 30 years, and the matrix that has given livestock a black eye throughout the world, that matrix is off by a factor of 3 to 4 if you have constant emissions. Why I don't read this throughout the world, why not every agriculturalist in the world knows this, I don't know, but the IPCC has just acknowledged it. And you will also see that throughout this report, GWP 100 is, GWP star is quoted. You see it here, you see it there. It's all over this report as a matrix that does a much better job to describe the impact of this gas on warming. So now you will, particularly if you're a farmer, will want to know, how do these two compare? This old way of accounting for methane versus the new way of accounting for methane. How do they compare? Well, wonder no more, because I would show you right now what happens when, in the first case, methane over a period of 30 years increases from a given industry by 35%, versus a second case where methane over 30 years is slightly reduced by 10%, but we call that a stable methane environment. And third, where methane over 30 years is strongly reduced, let's say because of mitigation is being used. GWP 100 would say that in all three cases, the increasing, the stable, and the decreasing scenario, we're adding a significant amount of additional CO2 equivalent emissions. It does not address the fact that methane is not a stock gas, but a flow gas. It acts as if methane were a stock gas. And that is where GWP 100 is so wrong. And this is of critical importance to animal agriculturalists throughout the world. It is mischaracterizing the fact that this gas is not just produced, but also destroyed. How does this GWP 100 that the world has been using for the last 30 years compared to GWP star, the new matrix that has now been published dozens of times? Here it is. Only if you increase methane by a lot, you are adding a lot of additional warming to our planet. That's the blue north of the x-axis. So an increasing of methane over time increases warming to our atmosphere. And we see this in parts of the developing world. I already talked about that. If you slightly reduce methane by 10% over 30 years,
this is a little bit linked back to quantification of carbon emissions, but back to the sort of foods actually produced. So the world needs to eat protein. You can source that protein from plants. You don't have to eat animal-based proteins. But there's a 5-to-1 difference in bioavailability of many nutrients you require from meat as opposed to plants. And so the question is, has the emission output from those different sources of protein been quantified on the GWP star basis and brought all the way back to this bioavailability within that food stuff? And is that sort of number globally?
The answer to that question is no, because the main greenhouse gas from animal agriculture is methane. Plant agriculture produces little methane. They produce nitrous oxide, they produce CO2, but not methane. And GWP star is only for methane. Okay, that's why the answer is no.
Sorry.
Just
a quick one.
Oh yeah. Okay.
That we go through that the end. There was an interesting, and I'm glad that there are people like you that are studying new light on what we already we think we know, but then it looks like these assessments are something that we have to, it's a fluid thing, we have to have new knowledge and update our accounting, and I completely agree with some of the things that you said. It was an interesting word from Max Planck University, Institute published last year, that all living organisms actually produce methane. And you're saying plants don't produce methane.
Well, they do, but not at that same level.
Yeah, it would be interesting to throw all of that into all what we know. We say it's not much, but did we quantify? Do we know?
Yeah. So yeah, I should eat my words. It's not that plants don't produce methane. In fact, trees, for example, do produce methane, but it's a different scale. Okay, it's a different scale. So we cannot neglect that though, because it's relatively insignificant compared to. So plant agriculture compared to animal agriculture are different ballgame with respect to methane. Plant agriculture has more of a nitrous oxide issue, because every time you incorporate fertilizer into the ground, some of that nitrogen you put in the ground will become nitrous oxide. And I don't need to tell you how much more potent nitrous oxide is than CO2. So let me just go through a couple more slides, and then we have a lot of time to cut the answer today. Or is there a clarification question? I need to address. Okay. So we talked about this. I showed you this, and we were right here. So what happens if you hold stable pretty much your methane over 30 years? Or you slightly reduce it by 10%, then look what happens to warming. You see the number, and a negative sign in front of the number And that means there's a little bit of negative warming, and the blue is south of the x-axis. So there's no additional warming added to our atmosphere if we slightly reduce methane over 30 years. No additional warming. But look what happens when you strongly reduce methane by 35% or so over 30 years. Then you are sucking a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the same as if you were to plant loads and loads of trees that suck CO2 out of the air. You're reducing warming when you reduce methane. This is really important, okay? When you reduce methane, you reduce warming. And because methane is our main greenhouse gas, this is a real opportunity to animal agriculture. Now comes one more technical slide, but it is an important, where I compare CO2 and methane from two industries, and I show you what happens under three scenarios: when we increase it, when we hold it stable, and when we decrease it. So this slide here shows on top emissions of CO2 and methane. Let's say a power plant over 30 years were to be ramped up in production of power. When you ramp it up, then you increase CO2 over time. And you see that here. Let's say the second one, the methane, CH4, were from a feedlot. At first, there were 10,000 cattle, and then after 30 years, there are 15,000 cattle. Then that would mean more methane over time, right? So both CO2, the power plant, and this feedlot here, methane, increase linearly with respect to emissions. What would these two scenarios do to warming? Well, because CO2 is a stock gas and accumulates in the atmosphere, it would lead to exponential increases in warming. But the linear increase of the feedlot methane would lead to a linear increase of the related warming. Now, if we hold both CO2 and methane stable, let's say the power plant over 30 years were to produce a constant amount of power, then it would produce a constant amount of CO2. And let's say our feedlot here had 10,000 cattle originally, and now it still does have 10,000. So both sources are now constant. What would that do to warming? Well, because CO2 accumulates and it's a stock gas, the related warming would still go up. But the constant methane source would produce constant warming. And that would be in compliance with the Paris Climate Accord. The constant source of methane uses constant warming. But now comes what's most exciting to me. What happens if we mitigate both CO2 and methane? So let's say our power plant over 30 years, at first it produced a lot of power. Eventually we shut it down because we want to go to net zero carbon. And on the other side, our feedlot, it doesn't have to be a feedlot, but let's say our methane source over time reduces its methane. So how would these two sources and the reduction of these respective gases affect warming? You see that even if you reduce CO2 and you finally shut down that power plant, the related warming still goes up until the point when you shut down the power plant, and at that point, the related warming is constant. That's what it takes for a CO2 source to no longer add additional warming. You have to shut it down. But look what happens to methane. The second you reduce methane, you reduce warming. So people ask me, Frank, do you think methane is a super pollutant, a super climate pollutant? Then I say, it is true it's potent, but in my opinion, CO2 is our super pollutant. Because even if we reduce it, the related warming still goes up all the way until we shut it down. And then the warming will plateau. Whereas to me, methane is a super opportunity. Because if we reduce methane, we reduce warming instantaneously. That is why I want people to really rethink methane. Not to, this is not some kind of creative accounting or some kind of greenwashing. It shows how the different nature of CO2 versus methane has a profoundly different impact on warming. And that, ladies and gentlemen, needs to be reflected by an appropriate matrix like GWP star. GWP 100 simply says, if the one goes up, the other one goes up. And that, as you can see here, is not the case. They are very different in how they behave. here, here, and here. And because this is where we want to go, we want to reduce methane. We need to know what that does to our water. Does that make sense here? This slide is very important. Comes from Miles Allen from Oxford, and we have talked about this at length. I think it's really important that people understand methane is not just simply a CO2 on steroids. It's not. It's different. And that is not just a small little nuance. This is a principal difference between these gases. Yes.
So you're referring that Korean sometimes in decode. You're talking there about animal methane, methane. You're not talking about methane that comes from other sources such as coal gas, cars, etc.
So while methane is in the air, regardless of the source, whether it's a fossil source or whether it's a biogenic source, as long as methane is in the air, it warms the planet. But after about a decade, it's gone. The difference between the fossil methane and the biogenic methane is that the carbon that's contained in the fossil methane is always additional and new. The one in the biogenic sphere is recycled methane. Okay. So on the fossil side, you're adding additional carbon to the atmosphere every time you burn fossil. On the biogenic side, that doesn't have to be the case. You either recycle existing carbon, you can even reduce carbon. But on the fossil side, you will always add additional carbon. But the radiative forcing of methane, regardless of source, is the same. But in the one case, you add additional carbon, in the other case, you recycle existing carbon. I will just show you two quick US examples, one for beef and one for dairy, because we have not really seen constant sources of methane. We have seen a pretty strong decline of methane sources, both from the beef and from the dairy herd in the United States and in most developed countries, including Australia. If you look at your sheep herd here over the last 40 years, which direction have you gone? And if you reduce methane, remember what that does to farming. Your sheep industry in this state and in this country has gone down, and with it, the methane. The total amount of methane from your sheep industry has gone down over the last 40 or 60 years, and that has had an impact on climate. And that's called negative warming. Some people call it cooling. I don't call it cooling because I don't want people to say sheep can cool the planet or cows can cool the planet. But a reduction of methane can reduce warming. That is what I'm on the record to say. So on the beef side, we used to have 140 million beef cattle. Now we have 90 million, so much fewer, but we are producing the same amount of beef. On the dairy side, we used to have 25 million dairy cows back in 1950. Today, we only have 9. We're from 25 down to 9, but with this much smaller herd today, we're producing 16% more milk. Carbon footprint of a glass of milk has gone down by 2/3. By 2/3. So I want to give you a little idea as to what has happened in California, because I already told you I travel around a lot, but I find the California example particularly intriguing because it works. We have to, in our dairy sector, reduce about 7 million metric tons of methane. That's the goal. The 40% reduction of methane equates to 7 million metric tons. And our dairy industry has to go down. So we have about half of 1% attrition per year, meaning our dairy herd is slightly shrinking, half of 1%, 0.5%. And that together with becoming more productive has a potential of reducing 2.6 to 3.3 million metric tons. Again, we have to reduce 7 in total. That in itself reduces 2.6 to 3.3. Manure practices like solid separators and other ways of taking some solids out of the manure stream have the potential to reduce methane as well. You see the numbers there. But by far the most important technology that we have learned to use in California is the use of anaerobic digestion, covering the lagoons and trapping the biogas, 60% of which is methane. That has a potential of reducing 4 million metric tons. Again, the goal is 7. That one technology alone will reduce 4 million metric tons. And we are now working very heavily in the Department of Animal Science on all different kinds of feed additives, some of which you are familiar with. And that has a potential, depending on how many people will use it and what type of feed additives people will use, to reduce anywhere from 250,000 to 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And that means that within the foreseeable future, until the year 2030, our dairy industry will have reduced anywhere between 7.6 to 10.6 million metric tons of CO2. That means they have to be 7, they will be above 7. They will be considerably above 7. And these reductions, many of these reductions are currently being metered. So there's no guesswork behind it. Okay? If you have a covered lagoon, then you produce this biogas, 60% of that is methane, as I said. You are then converting the biogas into a fuel type for heavy-duty trucks and buses. And that conversion is being metered. So we know exactly which dairy produces how much biogas, because they get paid for it. It's being metered. So none of this is guesswork anymore. We will achieve the regulatory requirement of reducing 40% methane, and we do it in a way where our farmers make money with it. And that's, of course, getting people's attention. What this slide here shows is that our dairy sector has already achieved, and they just started a few years ago, 30% of its reduction. What you see on this slide here is this typical California dairy, and the lagoon that used to be open and the biogas used to just escape into the air. That lagoon is now covered, and what's floating out there is biogas. So 60% of that biogas is methane. They take the biogas and they don't burn it directly to make power, but they take the biogas and convert it into fuel for these heavy-duty vehicles, for buses, for trucks. They sell it off. And this conversion of biogas from lagoons to fuel for transportation is the most carbon negative pathway there is. That sounds like something bad, but it's very good. It means it's the greatest difference to fossil fuels. And because of that, the state of California pays so-called low carbon fuel standard credits. Low carbon fuel standard credits, that's a mouthful. And these low carbon fuel standard credits historically ran very high, about $2,000 per cow per year. Contrast that to the $4,000 per cow per year that a dairy makes from the sales of their milk. Half of that came in through the sales of those carbon credits. So these carbon credits have gone down some, but they're still sizable. And that has led to a situation where when 5 years ago we had 10 digesters in the state of California, now we have 220. And in 5 years from today, about half of all cows in California will not just produce milk, but they will also produce carbon credits. And they will generate a sizable income. So this is a new gold rush in the state of California, of people having to comply with the law, but being enumerated in ways that makes it very attractive. Our industry understands there are environmental laws and they have to comply, but they can do that while making money. And that's the way it works. In my opinion, the clean approach of rules, regulations, fines, and taxes has no chance versus the incentive, the voluntary incentive. Everybody in the room here who is a parent who has kids knows that the carrot approach works better than the cane. Many policymakers don't understand that yet. But I have a lot of visitor groups from all over the world coming to California to see why it works with us, why it works for us. So this is what it looks like when you take this biogas from a dairy, this stuff here, this stuff here, and you convert it into vehicle fuels. And so you see here, dairy RNG, renewable natural gas, going into those vehicles here, replacing diesel with the much greener renewable natural gas. I already said that we do a lot of research around feed additives. Here you see some of them. There are feed additives that have the capacity to reduce anywhere between 10 to 40% enteric methane. Australia, Europe, several South American countries are allowed to use feed additives. In the US, we are currently not allowed to use feed additives. And the reason is that the Food and Drug Administration is overseeing it, and they're requiring Food and Drug Administration supervised research, costing millions and millions of dollars. And without that, nobody can have a label claim on the product and sell it to producers. We hope that this will change because we're already having several technologies that work. In addition to feed additives, there's also now low methane breeding. Methane is a heritable trait. We can now breed for low methane cows, low methane sheep. There are now genomic tests for low methane producing animals. And that will be in our toolbox in the years to come. The New Zealand is working on a methane vaccine. And they are quite bullish that that will become reality soon. And they are also working on a bolus. And that bolus contains a slow-release active ingredient that can be deployed in animals that are not being seen every day, let's say grazing animals. So that makes us quite hopeful as well. So there are many different approaches. So in addition to anaerobic digesters and solid separators and so on, things you do with manure, there are many things you can do with the animals. And of course, there are also ways you can treat your soils to allow the soils to maximize soil carbon sequestration. This is an image here showing the years 2020 to 2030. And on the y-axis, you see the amount of CO2 warming equivalents. So that's using GWP star. And in gray, you see what would happen in the California dairy industry with business as usual if people don't mitigate methane. In light blue, you see what happens if we were to reduce 40% of methane from lagoons. And in dark blue, you see what will happen if you use 40% lagoon methane reduction plus a 10% reduction of enteric methane. You see that by the year 2027, our dairy industry will be climate neutral. We will no longer cause additional warming by the year 2027. And the stronger we reduce methane, the more warming negative we will be and the more carbon credits we can sell. And that is already happening today. I've seen it many, many times that dairies are now selling carbon credits to BMW, to Shell, to other fossil fuel companies. You have a question?
Yeah, I do. Don't ask my president of Wesfarmers. I think the point you made about California paying incentives is good, but this map implies that that there is a warming component there. Whereas if it's static, then it should be at zero for starters and then working its way down. Only that we're not even the business as usual should be above the line; it should be static. And I think we've got to get a baseline set right so that we can maximise the benefit of farmers for any reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we do. And under that map there, that doesn't imply that we're at a static level.
So, and I'm glad you're asking this. I want to make clear one thing. The world will not stop using GWP 100. The world has been using GWP 100 for 3 decades. They're not just flipping the switch saying, never mind. They will continue using that. But I encourage localities like yours to do in parallel or to use in parallel to GWP 100, which we now know is not accurate. In addition to using that, also to use GWP star. Why? Because that actually can tell your farmers at what point in the future they can achieve climate neutrality and what they need to do to get them there, to get to that point. If they reduce methane, they will offset other greenhouse gases. They will get to a point where they no longer cause additional warming. And GWP star can delineate how to get there and by when to get there. And that's what farmers need to know. They can't really do anything with the GWP 100. How much do you care whether you produce 112 or 120 million metric tons of CO2e? It doesn't mean anything to a farmer, right? But if somebody were to say to your sector, in the next 6 years, you can be climate neutral, don't contribute to additional warming if you do the X, Y, and Z. And beyond that,
Aren't we already? That's the point I'm trying to make.
no, you're not already there. You're not already there. You're not already there because if everybody were to do only grazing, maybe, but we don't just do grazing. We have, for example, feedlots where crops are fed that receive chemical fertilizers and so forth. There are fossil inputs into the livestock sector today that do cause additional warming. And we need to offset those as well. And we can do that through reducing methane. That's why. So if you're interested in reading more about this, recently I did this year a paper with two of my colleagues on informing the California agencies on what this law that they put out years ago without knowing, this 40% reduction law, what that does to warming, how actually that's achievable, and how it can be done in an economic way, where we take our farmers along the ride, rather than chastise. Recently, a few weeks ago, we published this paper. It's quite technical. So for those of you who are academicians and interested in the nitty-gritty of what I talked about today, they will find this paper interesting. It shows how much this GWP star is superior over this traditional GWP 100. This GWP star really reflects what's happening to warming. And that's what it's all about. It's a matrix that's fit for purpose. And GWP 100 is not. GWP 100 has caused the world's livestock sector to have a black eye the size of the earth. And it's time for our industries to know that, to get it right, and to act accordingly to help do their bit. This is a white paper that you find on the TIA Center webpage. It shows how the US beef and dairy industry can become climate neutral, but it has Excel spreadsheets that you can use for your industries to predict the same here in Western Australia, to show how you can achieve climate neutrality here, if you so wish. This here is a short 10-minute YouTube video called Rethinking Methane. It explains everything I just did in an hour, in 10 minutes, or 5 minutes. It's easy to understand, easy to share with people, and so on. I encourage you to do so. I have 2 more minutes or so that I want to go through. And that's because Australia is in a very, very special situation. Before I talk about that, just really briefly, the 2050 challenge, many people have heard about it. What it is the challenge of a drastically growing human population and the implication it has for human food supply. What you see on this slide is on the x-axis, the year 1750 to 2050, hence the name 2050 challenge. And on the z-axis, you see the total human population in billions. I'm a little over 50, and when I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people. 3. Today, we have 8 billion people in the world. And by the time I'm an old man, we will have 9.5 billion people in the world. Or in other words, throughout my lifetime, human population on this planet will have tripled. 3 times more people on this planet throughout our lifetime, ladies and gentlemen. But we don't have 3 times more natural resources to feed these people. And this is something humanity needs to understand. We need to learn how to make best use of those natural resources that we have set aside to grow food for human beings. And those clowns who are out there will say we should get rid of animal agriculture and replace all of that with plant agriculture. They need to learn what I'm about to say. First of all, this increasing human population is certainly a challenge. And as you can see, that challenge is not so much in the developing world, but in the developed world, in first world countries, but much more so in developing countries. Not because everybody's having 10 babies, but largely because of an increasing life expectancy in these countries. When people grew, like let's say 50 or 60 in the past, they now live to 70 and 80. And cumulatively, that means more mouths to feed. So that's the 2050 challenge. How do we feed these people? This is one of my favorite slides. It shows the world in a circle over Southeast Asia. And this circle, ladies and gentlemen, contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside the circle than outside the circle. And this circle is your neighbor. This circle is your neighbor. And this circle currently does not produce enough food. And that makes you a natural supplier of food for people who live there. This is probably my last technical slide. It shows in color those areas in the world where we can grow crops to feed people and animals. And now I show you one of the simplest tricks I know, but I think is very illustrative. Imagine this sheet of paper, regular sheet of paper, being the surface of the entire Earth. That's what you see. That's the entire Earth. I now fold this sheet of paper and I fold it twice until it's roughly the size of a postcard. What you see now is the area of the world that's land. The difference between the whole sheet and this is water and ice. This is all the land we have in the world. This here is my business card. And the equivalent amount of land of my business card is all agricultural land. So this here is all land, and this is all agricultural land in the world that we can use to feed other people there on this planet. That's all the agricultural land. Now I fold this business card into one piece that's 2/3 and the other that's 1/3. And then I rip my own business card into pieces. Again, this here is all of agriculture. The 2/3 piece is what we refer to as marginal land. It's called marginal land because we cannot grow crops on the majority. Why not? Because it's either too dry, there not enough water, or it's too rocky, too hilly, it's not fertile enough. What grows here on this marginal land is largely cellulose-containing grasses. Cellulose, by the way, is the world's most abundant biomass. What do we do with this land currently? 2/3 of all agricultural land, the marginal land. What do we do with it currently? We graze it with what? With ruminants. Why do we do that? Because they are the only ones that can digest cellulose. Nobody else can. Nobody else can digest that cellulose other than ruminants. So it is true what our critics say, that 2/3 of all agricultural land is used for livestock. But what they leave out in this description is, if it weren't for the livestock animals, we could not make use of 2/3 of all agricultural land for human food production at all, or at least the vast majority. And that would leave only 1/3 of my business card, which is the so-called arable land. This is the marginal land, this is the arable land, and that's how limited we are in the world to feed a growing global population. And who in the world is better at utilizing this than the people sitting in front of me? You. Because what you do is you grow these animals, these ruminant livestock, in very efficient ways. You make use of that land mass to produce nutrient-dense food from upcycled nutrients. Not recycled, upcycled. Cellulose that nobody else can digest, they can. And they produce milk and meat, very nutrient-dense, not just protein-rich, but nutrient-dense foods that are rivaled by nothing else. So to me, this is really important to leave you with that notion that what we do in this country here is making the best use of the resources you have. And those people who want to get rid of animal agriculture really should think twice, because without that, you'll not be able to meet the 2050 target. So with that, I'm on Twitter. This is my handle. My center, of course, is on the web. clear.ucdavis.edu is the web address. Apologize for the technical difficulties. I hope that was too bad. And now let's just open it up for questions. You can ask anything you want.
Thanks so much for that, Frank. We had a few questions as we've gone. I know there's quite a lot more, and we've got some questions online as well. I'll take one from the floor here, and then I'll go to online. So,
yeah, I don't master. A couple of very simple questions. I thought the 28 times did take into account some GWP 100, that it wasn't just a cumulative type equation. And my other second question is, over about the last 100 years, I think atmospheric methane has increased 8 or 10 times. Can you offer an explanation why that is?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part of the question. So what's going on with methane? So methane went up until the year 2006, then it plateaued for a while. It actually went up, and then around 2006, the time right before that, there was a plateau for 10 years, and then all of a sudden went back up. What happened during that time, for example, in the United States, was certainly not a change in livestock inventories. We didn't all of a sudden increase livestock inventories, but we saw increases in methane. What happened during that time when methane went up was that the US started fracking. All of a sudden, we started fracking, and then with that, every time we extracted the stuff with fossil fuel, a lot of methane came out. And when they are done with the fracking, they leave the wells open. And they just keep spewing. I see it from satellites every day. I have access to satellite surveillance, and I see those formerly used wells continue to spew out methane, and nobody's plugging. That is what has changed. Livestock numbers have not, at least not in most developed countries. Livestock numbers have gone up in much of the developing world. For example, India and Brazil, these two countries, have more cattle than the rest of the world combined. These two countries have more cattle than the rest of the world combined. And any kind of inefficiency in a country like India has a huge consequence to global livestock numbers. The IPCC estimates, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, estimates that between 70 to 80% of global livestock-related methane, greenhouse gases, stem from developing countries, and 20 to 30% from developed countries. Why? Because the production per animal is so much lower that they need to compensate that with larger herds. So while in the United States we have 9 million dairy cows, in India they have 300 million. They could produce the same amount of milk with a 1/10 of the number they currently have. Now there are other complicating issues like religion and so on with respect to India, but in many developing countries, livestock numbers are very high because these animals are not just raised to produce food, but also because there's a social security system, there are a payment system, they have all different kinds of functions other than producing food. In much of Africa, you would not grow cattle in order to slaughter them in the shortest amount of time. The tribe or the family, they have a herd of cattle, and they will not slaughter those animals after they mature, but they will slaughter those animals when they're about to fall over of old age. Then they eat them. And by that time, they might be 15 or 20 years old. And that has a cumulative environmental footprint that's high. So do we know how to lower that? Absolutely we do. Some of the work I do with the FAO in Rome really goes in this direction, to help many countries in the developing world to produce food more efficiently. That's one issue. Another issue that I haven't touched, and that is the number one environmental issue of our food system, is the food that we don't eat. About 40%, 40, of the food produced in the world today is never eaten. 40. Not just in developed countries like ours, but even in developing countries. But there, they're called food losses. They're occurring more at the producer level. In developed countries, they're happening in our kitchens and restaurants. 40 is a global number that the FAO has published of food we never eat. I think everybody, regardless of what they eat, whether they are vegans or carnivores, and anyone in between, should agree that this is unacceptable, that we are wasting these masses of food. And yet all that focuses on belching cows. And I don't want to make fun of this. Okay? I am on the record as saying we need to do our share and reduce the climate footprint. But the lion's share of the problem is we know where it is. So there was the first part of the question. So the GWP 100 assigns the impact of that gas over a 100-year period. Methane it doesn't have a lifespan. It has a much shorter lifespan. It does not account appropriately for the actual physics of methane at the time that this gas is out there in the atmosphere. That gas is never in the atmosphere for 100 years. We should not use the matrix that.
I've got a question from online. We'll swap to those. A question from Matt Douglas. Do you expect the EU's program towards green diplomacy and its potential impact upon trade, tariff and quota regimes to spread to Australia's other key red meat trade partners, such as Japan, South Korea, the US, and China?
I have to read that again.
So it's much about our trade partners and what might be coming.
So if the EU or the US or somebody has a policy like a Green Deal or New Green Deal, or whatever they call it, will that affect other regions? Absolutely, yeah. It absolutely has that potential.
Do you see that there are, have you heard indications from trading partners, such as Japan or South Korea? And we see our states, we sell a lot of land in particular, high value land into the US.
Yeah. So I'm not so much concerned about government policies around that. What I'm more concerned and aware of is that customers of yours, whether it's Walmart or McDonald's or Sam's Club, large customers, that they have expectations on how that product that they buy is raised. So if you were to say, I'm a farmer here in Western Australia, I don't believe in climate change. Leave me alone with that stuff. I stick my head in the sand and I don't want anything to do with that. But your customers say, and I'm not saying that you're doing that at all. I'm not saying that. I know the opposite is true. But if you were to say that, your customers would say, we can buy our lamb, we can buy our beef, and we can buy our dairy products anywhere we want them. And those places that have the same value as we have will be the ones we are buying from. That is exactly what's happening today. The Nestle's, the Starbucks. Starbucks is the world's largest consumer of milk because of all the lattes and cappuccinos and so on. If they say we have goals, environmental goals, that all our suppliers need to abide by, then they can be changed. Same is true if McDonald's says from now on we only buy sustainably raised beef. They're doing that. It's happening right now. So that gets everybody's attention fast. So we don't have to wait for governments to come up with some international schemes. It's already happening with main customers.
A question up the back still, and then here.
Thanks, Mandy. Philip Gardner, farmer in Laura. I'm really excited about the prospects that we have for the livestock farmers in Western Australia. That means wool and for meat. But the methane, the methane production of those animals is key to getting the carbon credits. And what I was going to ask is, in California, how well developed is that market? And do you have some pointers of whom we should talk to, try and get something moving in this country, because I think it's such an exciting prospect?
Well, thank you for that question. That question is actually critical for things to move. If you don't have a carbon market, you don't have a market, you cannot sell or buy anything. You have to have a market. So that if you do the right thing and you reduce your carbon emissions, then you can sell those credits. If you can't do that, then why wouldn't you? You can do it because you want to be a good person, but you will not have a financial revenue without a market. So California does have a cap and trade. California does have a carbon market, and that allows people to buy and sell carbon credits. And that's the reason why all of this works. That's the reason why people can go and get low carbon fuel standard credits and so-called RIM credits, federal credits, that generate a lot of revenue. Some of these investments are paid down in 3 to 5 years. And then they generate a lot of additional income. And because now everybody knows this, everybody who has the ability will jump on that. Without a carbon credit system, without a market, none of this will work. People will not just build multi-million-dollar installations because they want to be nice people. They will not just eat some additive because they want to be nice people. In fact, if you just do that today, if you were to do things to reduce methane today, and you don't have any kind of market, you don't have any kind of mechanism, and you're now doing this, let's say for the next 5 years, and in 5 years they're starting this new scheme, then what you have done over the last 5 years would say, you're not doing anything new. You have already done that, so you're not getting credit for what you've done the last 5 years. It's called additionality. That is something that I find tremendously unfair. People who have done the right thing for the last 5, 10, 15 years will not get credit for that. But they will only get credit for the time once these things start. Then they will get credit. So it's very important for you as producers to work with policymakers to develop policies and markets so that your sector can develop goals for the future and also benefit from reducing emissions financially.
One there, I'll go to this lady afterwards and then online for more.
Michael Humphrey, with us next door. You talked of the technologies that the American dairy industry have adopted and the effects of that. What about American broadacre industries such as the cattle industry in Texas? What technologies are they able to adopt to do similar things to the American dairy industry?
So what do our beef producers do?
Yeah.
So
on a broad scale rather than exit industries.
So in the United States, there are 750,000 ranches, important stations. On average, 50 mama cows. That's the average for the 750,000 ranches. And we have 1,400 feedlots. The feedlots can make changes pretty much instantaneously because you have everyday access to those animals. You could, for example, use additives, right? But what do we do with grazing animals? That's the million-dollar question. And what do we do with animals that we don't have daily access to? And that is something that is under intense investigation throughout the world. And particularly here in this country and in New Zealand and in Uruguay, they are thinking about what can we do with animals that we don't have daily access to. The answers might go into the direction of breeding for low methane animals, of vaccination against methane, and of using a bolus that slowly releases an active ingredient. So you put it in the animal at mustering time, and then next time you muster those animals, you put it in the animal. That is probably the direction it will go, because you don't have manure management either. You're not managing the manure, it falls where it falls. So it's much more difficult for grazing animals to mitigate these gases than it is for intensively kept animals. But it's particularly important that we get it right for grazing animals because what generates methane, it's roughage. The roughage in the diet is what drives methane. The methanogens in the rumen, they thrive off roughage or fiber. Roughage. The more roughage is in the diet, the more methane they produce. And grazing animals produce more methane because they eat more roughage, more fiber. So it is very important that we get that right, that we get techniques, technologies, tools to those who don't have daily access to it. I don't have a really good answer for you right now because the priority of different companies doesn't seem to go that direction, but it should.
Switch to an online question again. Among the current uses of GWP 100, emissions, reporting, carbon markets, targets, which do you think could be usefully replaced by GWP Star?
Which users will use GWP Star in the future?
Because we use GWP 100 for accounting, for targets, for markets.
Yeah.
Which one, or can it be all the GWP Star would replace GWP 100?
Yeah, so GWP Star will not replace GWP 100 for all groups. For example, when you compare different products, let's say an Impossible Burger versus a beef burger, GWP, GWP 100, GWP Star would not be replaced for doing that. Because the one of these two products has mainly methane associated with it, the other one not. But for example, if you set goals for, let's say, Western Australia's beef or dairy industry, then you should use GWP star, because you can tell these industries when in the future they will be climate neutral or net zero warming. You can do that. And you can look at what kind of mitigation techniques can get you there. Because that's what farmers want to know. What am I supposed to do? And how can I achieve that? And are there means for being incentivized to do that? Because somebody has to pay for it. If we cannot pay for it, if farmers cannot pay for it, it will not happen. It's that simple. It will not just happen because somebody up there decides it needs to be done. The farmers have to understand that, and they have to be willing to be part of it. And I have seen it myself. I stand in front of hundreds, sometimes more than that, farmers all over the United States. And believe me, the topic of climate, of livestock and climate, is not a very popular one. But they take it and they learn from it and they say, oh, that makes sense. I can do this. And if somebody helps me to pay for it, and if I can be greener while staying in the green, and the green means, you know, in the black, then I'll do that.
Hello, Frank. Look, I've just got a bit of a burning question here. When you mention leadership and you use the word hope a few times and opportunities, I'm here thinking, wow, your center is doing great work. And for instance, in the feed and how you modify that feed to reduce methane in the end, there's so much opportunity in there for research. And this is where it leads me to hope and the talk about hope and the industry and farmers being leaders of hope. And right in front of us, we have an example here of the Botanic Research Station leading by demonstration research and development. I wonder, can you please inspire us with one example of something that will keep us going in this joint journey?
Yeah, so I mean, I see opportunities everywhere. I see opportunities where tools that were developed by researchers, sometimes also by farmers, where these tools make a huge difference. Where, I don't know, digesters, for example, capture something that normally would go into the air, and they are now producing a utility. Think about it. I mean, you're far away from Europe, right? The Ukraine war doesn't touch you the way it touches European countries. But I'm just back from Finland, from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland, where all of a sudden, pretty much overnight, half of the energy went away. All these energy supplies from Russia stopped, where a third of all fertilizers stopped, because so much of that came from Belarus, from Ukraine, from Russia. It's now not coming. Where there's all of a sudden a situation where farmers are filling important voids. They are not just producing meat and milk and eggs. Now they're producing energy, biogas. They're fueling vehicle fleets. They are now harnessing in on the nutrients that come out the other end of animals that are, by the way, in a ratio that's almost perfectly suited to most crops. The nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium coming out of the back end of our livestock is almost exactly the ratio that most crops need. And now that many chemical fertilizers are not being produced, people are standing in line to get animal manure as fertilizer again. So all of a sudden we see how important farming is. We have to remember most people in urban communities, and that's particularly true here in Australia, where so many of your people live in cities, have no connection with farming. People do not know where their food comes from. They think of the supermarkets where they buy their food, when they think about where food comes from. They do not necessarily understand what you do and how you do it. They have lost the connection to farming. You have to reestablish that connection. People actually do have trust in you if you engage with them. Farmers are actually respected, believe it or not, they are. But oftentimes they choose not to be too closely connected to their customers. They pretty much want to be left alone. They said, we know what we do it well, leave us alone. Those days, ladies and gentlemen, are over. Particularly the younger generation want to know where their food comes from. And if they don't get answers, they keep asking. And what I'm observing is that these answers about where food comes from and how it's produced, if not answered by farmers, are answered by some extremists, some activists, and then we read it day in, day out in the news. Everybody in the room knows what I'm talking about. How many of you have read a positive story about animal agriculture the last 5 years? How many of you have seen negative stories about animal agriculture within the last week? Right? It's the truth.
Hi, I'm Peter Irons from Livestock University. Just a simple question about the fact that, as I understand it, methane is destroyed in the atmosphere back to CO2, right? And whether, and so it's converted from a short-living greenhouse gas to a very long-living greenhouse gas. Whether that's accounted for in the models which show the negative warming potential of reduced methane production.
Yes. So this is that's where I want to go. So some of you will wonder, look, it starts out with atmospheric CO2 going through plants, and then the methane is generated, and then it goes from this short-lived methane again back to this long-lived CO2. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that CO2 that results from the oxidation of methane, that CO2 is not new. It was in the atmosphere before and is there now again. That CO2 that's on top, this CO2 on top is nothing else than the CO2 that went into the soil system. This is not additional. So the fact that it went from a short-lived climate fluid back to a long-lived climate fluid doesn't really matter, because that's what it used to be. That's where it came from. There's no additional carbon we're adding to this.
Tim Johnston, I'm an ag consultant. Just down at individual cow level, as you increase productivity, for instance, double the milk production, what does that do to methane production? Does that go up in a certain ratio?
Yeah, so very important. What happens if the cow becomes more productive, produces more? The high producing cow will produce more methane than a low producing cow. But what happens in reality is that in a certain state or country, if your herd now produces more product, then generally the herd size shrinks. You're producing a constant, pretty much a constant amount of product with a smaller herd than before. So, for example, the average dairy cow in India might produce something like 1,000 or so kilograms of milk. The average cow in California, where I live, produces about 11 tons. So one California cow produces the same as 11 cows in India.
But what's the percentage increase in methane in the California cow with 11 times more production?
It is higher than it would be if she were to produce 10 tons, but it would be more than a 10-ton cow. But overall, because the markets are such that only a certain amount of dairy product is sold, it leads to an attrition of our herd size. So our herd sizes are relatively shrinking. While we produce the same amount of output or more over time, we are relatively shrinking herd numbers. And that has had a pretty significant impact on the environmental footprint of our herd.
Sorry, was that a
comment on that? I think the Indian cow, though, is much more cellulose in its diet, which produces a lot more methane than a TMR to the California dairy. So if you factor that in, it might even be less. It is.
So, I mean, I always wonder if I should even talk about India, because India is such an outlier because of the fact that there are also religious components. As you know, cattle are holy. And so if a cow falls out of production, no longer lactates, then this cow will not be slaughtered. This cow will walk around aimlessly, walking around and eating and excreting and polluting, but not producing milk for the majority of its lifetime. These animals might live 15 or more years, but only produce a fraction of that time frame milk. And that means this is the same, we call it idle animals. This is like you having a car in your driveway and it runs, but you're not driving it. That's an idle car. When these cows no longer lactate, but they eat and excrete and pollute, then they are idle animals. And in many developing countries, there are very large herds of idle animals. Please do not take my words as somebody from a developed country pointing fingers at others in the developing world. I'm not doing that. But the fact is, there are hotspots in the world that we need to help them reduce impacts. And we can do that. We can absolutely do that. Better veterinary care, better genetics, better feeding, better reproduction are very essential tools to reduce the global impact of livestock on the environment.
Thank you, Mandy. Hi, thank you very much for today, Frank. My name is Nicola Parker. I'm here with Wesfarmers Dairy Council, Dairy Australia, and somebody who milks cows on weekends, but a professional 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. I'd first like to talk to Labour's comment down the front about leadership. I think we're all leaders. If every single person walked out of this room today and gave a snippet of the information that we've seen on the screen today about the difference in carbons, we can definitely make a difference. I work with townies Monday to Friday, and they now, a sizable amount of them, come to me because they know I play with cows at the weekend and ask where they can buy their produce from, how they can buy more sustainably, and what's the real impact that we as livestock farmers have on the world's climate and everything else. And the amount of people who walk away after 5 or 10 minute chat over coffee with me with a completely different understanding of it is huge. So we can all lead and influence the message of everybody that is not in our industry. And I think we own that, and that belongs to us. So I just wanted to talk to that piece. But my question was actually about the homeostasis of the rumination of a cow. When we're talking about putting in a bolus or a vaccine, do we have any concerns about what we are potentially doing to the ongoing health and productivity of an animal? So when we're talking about TMRs, when we're changing the percentage of dry matter that we're putting into cows, and obviously we're measuring methane that way, we know that the cows that we are feeding, we know about their productivity, inputs, outputs, and therefore what they're putting in is a measurable piece of methane. When we start to play with their homeostasis by putting in a bolus or playing with a vaccine that hasn't been generated over 10, 20, 30, 40 years worth of research into what we're putting into the animal, is there a great risk there that actually we're going to see negative impacts of what we're potentially spending too much money on, rather than pushing the focus on managing the methane more effectively, such as the biodigesters and the ongoing, income or value of that to society through energy and such?
Yeah, I think it will not surprise you that a scientist says we need more research. But we really need more research before the world's dairy and beef and other sectors go into, let's just take this one technology and then produce thousands of tons and feed it. Before we do this, we need to look not just at the intended, but also the unintended consequences. I have seen some active ingredients in feed additives that are well-known carcinogens, or that will break down in well-known toxins that can accumulate in milk and meat. I am the last person standing here saying, let's just come up with all these great additives and start feeding. We need to look at unintended consequences. If a feed additive affects palatability or toxicology, or if it's just not available at the amounts that we need, well, then guess what? Then maybe it's not the right one. We need to look at these things holistically, and we need to do this research aggressively, fast, because we need fast solutions. You all know that you have plans here to be, I think you call it carbon neutral by 2030. In order to achieve that, you need to be chop, right? You need to have tools at hand quickly. But that means you need to make sure that these things work and that you don't have unintended consequences. For some of the additives, these consequences exist. So I completely mirror what you just said, and I keep saying it to everybody I talk to. We need way more research on this, and the public sector will have to pay some of that.
A question from online. Thank you. It's from Lindsay Woolridge. It's about a feed additive, the seaweed one.
and it can be used to reduce methane emissions. And it could probably be used, I guess, in raising animals by putting the feed additive out in the paddock. That has an active ingredient called chloroform, which is a sister chemical to chloroform, and both have carcinogenic properties. Lindsay's concern is that all that chloroform will into the meat, either in muscle or the fatty tissues, lodge there, and if humans eat that meat, that as a result in more cancer in humans. And that's one of the unintended consequences. So he's asking if there's any research being done on that.
So most of the research is done in Australia, not surprisingly, because you produce the majority of it. We're talking about Aspergillus taxiformis as the main seaweed at question here. There are also some other varieties. It is true that bromoform is a well-known carcinogen. When it's in those animals, they break it down into bromine and iodine, and both bromine and iodine are toxins. And bromine can accumulate in milk. I've seen that in Aspergillus fed cows up to 3 months after being fed. So when it stopped, when the feeding stopped, 3 months later, there was still bromine in the milk. But the question as to whether or not these concentrations are high enough to affect human health is one of those. There are Aspergillus feeding regimens where you don't find these issues because the concentration is low enough. So we have to find out how much is too much. And we have to find this out quickly, because once this is publicly known, people will say, oh, we should just forget about that. And we don't want to take things off the table at this point. None of those technologies should be taken off the table until we really understand them, in my opinion. And there's that risk, okay, that we take things off the table before we really understand them well. So I think the good thing about Aspergillus is it has a huge impact on reducing that. But the negative impact, if you feed too much, is decrease in palatability, significant decrease in feed intake, and potential toxicological impact. So we don't want to overfeed. We need to know exactly how much and how much.
Back here,
I'm Paulina Costa from Reuters Agri, and also from Uruguay. And regarding the grazing establishments, I'm wondering if maybe the answer is, instead of reducing methane, is maybe increasing carbon sequestration in the soil by regenerative grazing. Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, it's not one or the other, it's one and the other. It's one and the other. We should increase soil carbon sequestration wherever we can. We know, for example, that rotational grazing is a great method of increasing soil carbon. And we should study very well how we can maximize soil carbon sequestration and soil carbon capture. Under conditions like those in your country, I was in Uruguay last year and traveled extensively there. There is a huge potential there. Same with New Zealand, same with Australia, same with Ireland. At this point, the world is acting as if that would just, they are not really giving credit to those people who optimize soil carbon sequestration, and it should. It should be audited, it should be compensated, because that is such an important biosystem service. We should absolutely account for it and compensate. But again, it's not one or the other, it is both.
I'm going to go with one last question, and I was just going to ask you, Frank, but if people have got follow-up questions, here's an opportunity for your blog, PC Davis. They've got some deep questions, they can post that on the blog. Is there an opportunity that way, or is that a bit hard? No,
so the next 2 weeks, I will not answer any questions. I'll travel around Australia and New Zealand, I can check with the tech cuddle. I will not have a lot of time during that time, but thereafter, if you send me an email, you will definitely get response. And if you need an immediate response, J. Proudman at ucdavis.edu, jproudman@ucdavis.edu will get that answer to you as fast as possible.
Thank you. Go to the last question, then we need to go to lunch and Frank's talking again a little bit, sorry. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Andy. Phil Barrett, UWA graduate. The question sort of follows on from Michael's question about the extensive industries. And there's a few questions and answers that have led to it. So here in Western Australia, we generally have 6 months of good, high quality grass. And then we have 6 months of poor quality either grass or crop stubbles. And so I suspect that our methane issues are perhaps more aligned to the dry, poor quality period of the 6 months, not so much the green. But then I do wonder about the possible solutions, and talked about sea leg and other things. One of them obviously is feeding more grain to animals. And when I did a little carbon accounting for my small farm, it said feed more grain. And that intuitively to me was going backwards because I thought pastures were more of an efficient. So just whether it is perhaps a little bit unique to some parts of the world where we have this particularly dry spell. And your comment about India and the idle stock, we actually have idle stock 3 or 4 months every year that are trying to survive until the next good spell. So it's sort of about, do you have any insights into how we might manage that? Because we actually put a haystack on the back of the cow and the back of the sheep, and then we take a bit off in the lean times. But that's probably quite methane intensive, is my guess.
Yeah. So first of all, I do not want to pitch one production system over another. Okay? I'm not promoting the one over another. I'll just describe to you what I know from the literature. What drives methane is largely 2 things: dry matter intake and roughage content of the diet. These 2 things is what the main predictors for methane. So if we compare, let's say, a corn finished steak in the United States with a grass finished steak, then the one is from an animal, corn finished, that was on pasture for 2/3 of its life. And for the last 4 months, they go to a feedlot and they receive a 90% concentrate diet. So when they're around 14 to 16 months of age, they go to slaughter. They are fully mature, go to slaughter. Their grass-finished peer stays on pasture their whole life. And they will be on pasture for 26 to 30 months of age. So they are roughly twice the age. And the grass-finished animals will have eaten throughout their life almost entirely a very high roughage diet, because there's no concentrate in their diet. So not just will the grass-finished animals have lived much longer and therefore eaten much more and drink much more and excreted much more and belch much more, but they will have eaten a diet that's higher in roughage that lends itself more to methane. Now, the corn-finished animal, the last 4 months of its life, will have produced very little methane. You go to feedlots and you look for rumination, you don't see very much belch. You don't see very much lying there and chewing the cud ruminating. And the reason is that there's so much roughage, so much concentrated in the diet. It doesn't lend itself as much to methane generation. But the feedlot finished animals, the corn finished animals, of course, receive that ration, that corn, from another place in the United States, from where it's grown and then shipped, let's say to California, and that has an environmental footprint too. So if you now really look at the entire life cycle of the grass-finished animal, soil carbon sequestration on one side, but also the longer lifetime and the higher roughage, versus the corn, shorter lifespan, high finishing concentrate diet, and the issue that the feed has to be grown elsewhere and transported. If you compare these two, then it will surprise people that the corn finished animal will not have a higher, but a relatively lower methane footprint. And that is a result of the efficiencies, the much shorter lifespan, and the difference in roughage content throughout the end of their lives. So while people always think a pasture is better because it's green and green is good, when it comes to that comparison, there are publications that prove otherwise. But I will never pitch one versus the other. I would just say, people say we should all just eat grass-finished animals because that's better for the environment. that is too much of a simplification, and it won't hold true. Efficiencies are directly related to emissions. The higher the efficiencies, the relatively lower the emissions. Everybody understands that when it comes to fuel efficiencies of a car. The car you drive today is much more fuel efficient than the car your parents drove, or the car your grandparents drove. They're all able to drive 100 kilometers, but your car today does it with a fraction of gas being used, and therefore a fraction of the emissions coming off it. Emission intensities and, production efficiencies and emission intensities are inversely related. And that's good.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the questions, both online and in person. Thank you, Frank. That was a tour de force. I reckon everyone would sit here for another 6 hours and having with questions, and we learn a lot. But thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulty at the end. As the leaders of the Deepest Climate Resilience Task Force and working with WALRC, we've certainly picked up the message probably a couple of years ago, led by Mandy and many others in the department and the universities about getting on with research. With our carbon neutral livestock research station, we want to keep up with some of the research that has been undertaken, including the sea-lock machine that's arrived here from the US to actually undertake some research on actually what happens in our pastures and the methane that comes off our cattle and our sheep, hopefully in the future. There's a QR code, so that will take you straight to the website there for that research station. And generally things that are happening in the climate resilience space in terms of what's going to be happening with our own agricultural sector emissions reduction strategy. Please click on that QR code, you'll get that information. For everyone that's listening and online, Frank's presentation will be sent out as a PDF. So that'll be everyone's registered, you'll be able to get a copy of that. And yeah, go easy on Frank in the next couple of weeks while he's traveling the world and doing good work. So can I ask everyone to put their hands together and thank Frank for his presentation.